My name is Cheryl DeStasso, and I'm the coordinator for the Fort Collins Community Action Network. Strength Through Peace is the sponsor of today's program, and they're an affiliate of the Fort Collins Community Action Network. The grandson of Greek immigrants, John Kiriakou was born in western Pennsylvania. Through his grandparents, John became steeped in Depression-era politics, developing not only a keen sense of the injustices that plagued American workers, but also a thirst for other cultures. John earned a degree in Middle Eastern Studies from George Washington University, where he became fluent in Greek. After graduating, he continued at George Washington, entering a master's program in legislative affairs. One of John's professors in graduate school was a CIA spotter and asked John to apply to the CIA, which he did. Early in his career, John became fluent in Arabic. In the late 90s, he spent a few years in Greece and narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by the radical group 17 November. The attempt instead claimed the life of a British defense attaché. In 2002, John was the chief counter-terrorist operations for the CIA in Pakistan, where he led a successful mission to capture Abu Zubaydah, at the time thought to be al-Qaeda's third-ranking leader. 2 years later, John left the CIA. He worked as a senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then as counterterrorism consultant for ABC News. In 2007, John disclosed details about the U.S. torture program in an interview with ABC News. Within days, the U.S. Justice Department began an aggressive investigation of John Kiriakou that spanned 5 years, continuing through Obama's first term. In 2012, John was arrested and indicted on 3 counts of violating the 1917 Espionage Act. John and his wife, at the time a CIA agent, both lost their jobs. John's legal defense bill cost $1 million, which left them with massive debt. To avoid risking a lengthy prison sentence and $1 million more in debt, John accepted a deal and pled guilty to disclosing the name of a CIA operative to a journalist. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison, even though the name of the operative was never released to the public. John entered the Laredo Federal Prison in February 2013 and served almost 2 years. He was released to house arrest a year ago in February and finally freed in June. Today, John works as an associate fellow at the Washington-based think tank for policy studies. John's traveled 65 countries and 43 states, and this is his first trip to Colorado. Fort Collins, please join me in welcoming John Kiriakou.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm embarrassed to say it's my first trip to Colorado. I actually used to tell people, sure, I've been to Colorado because I went through the airport once on the way to Santa Fe. Well, thank you very much to Strength Through Peace, first of all, for having me here today. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to talk about a couple different things. I hate being the torture guy. I never really considered myself to be the torture guy, but this is the position I've found myself in. But more than torture, I'd also like to talk about ethics in intelligence operations, because frankly, there aren't any ethics in intelligence operations. So I'd like to start by talking about Abu Zubaydah. I had been in the CIA for about 12 years before I had even heard of Abu Zubaydah. I spent the first 7.5 years of my career as an analyst working on Iraq, mostly in the Middle East. I spent a couple of years in Bahrain. I served in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and really worked on Iraqi issues all those years. But I got bored, and in the late 1990s, I switched. I made a very unusual switch to counterterrorism operations, and found after going through the training that I actually had a knack for it. The job really is simple to describe. It's hard to actually carry out, but the job of a CIA case officer or operations officer is to recruit spies to steal secrets. Easy as that. Or to recruit spies to infiltrate terrorist groups on your behalf. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into that, but it's doable. And like I said, I found that I had a knack for it, and I enjoyed myself very much. So after the September 11th attacks, like everybody else in the building, I volunteered to go to Afghanistan. To do what? I didn't know, and I didn't frankly care, but everybody was volunteering, and I thought that it was my patriotic duty to volunteer as well. After all, I spoke Arabic, and I was one of only about 12.5 people in the entire CIA who spoke Arabic, if you can imagine such a thing. But they didn't send me to Afghanistan. So I kept threatening and begging and threatening, and finally they said, all right, they were just tired of hearing it. You can go to Pakistan. I said, okay, when? Tomorrow. I said, okay, what do you want me to do there? We want you to be the chief of counterterrorism operations. I said, great. Well, I had never been the chief of counterterrorism operations anywhere, let alone in Pakistan, right after September 11th. So I flew to Pakistan the next day and introduced myself to we're not allowed to say station chief. We say the senior CIA officer in country. I introduced myself to this senior CIA officer. And he said, okay, welcome. What I want you to do is I want you to come up with a standard operating procedure for taking down a terrorist safe house. I said, okay. Well, I didn't even know where to begin. So I sat down at a desk with a legal pad, and I thought, so what would I do if I were to take down a terrorist safe house? Well, I guess I'd want it to be dark, so like the middle of the night. I wouldn't want anybody to see me, and frankly, I would want the terrorists to be sleeping. So I wrote 0200 at the top of the page. And I came up little by little with this plan, and our Pakistani partners, I'll call them, said that they thought they had found a safe house where somebody was holed up. And I said, okay, well, let's hit it. So we went out at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was about a half a dozen of us. We had a battering ram, and we broke down the door, and there was a 19-year-old Tunisian kid in there, and he started crying and asking for his mother, and that was my first Al-Qaeda fighter. This became a pattern. I came face to face with Al-Qaeda many, many times, and almost to a man. They were children, mostly teenagers or people in their early 20s. And they had several things in common. And this really was the very start of a transition in my thinking about Al-Qaeda and about Islamic terrorism. They were all illiterate. They were all jobless, and indeed had no job skills of any kind. They were all from isolated villages in their home countries: Yemen, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Syria, all over the place. But from these very isolated villages, nobody was from any of the big cities. I never understood this next one. None of them had good relationships with their fathers, which I thought was fascinating, but I'm not a psychologist, so I was never really clear on what that meant in the greater scheme of things. And invariably, the village imam would go up to these guys and say, what are you doing here in this village? You can't read and write. You have no job. You have no future. No man would let his daughter marry somebody like you. You should go make jihad against the Americans, because if you do, we'll give you $50 a month. And if you're martyred, we'll give your family $500. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this ticket and you're going to fly to Dubai. And when you get to Dubai, somebody will meet you and they'll give you a ticket to Karachi, Pakistan. In Karachi, somebody will pick you up and take you to a safe house, and then finally we'll get you to a training camp in Afghanistan and you can train. Well, these guys didn't have any beef against the United States. They didn't know the Quran. They couldn't read. They didn't know what the prayers were. They weren't particularly religious. They just simply didn't have anything else to do. And they didn't have any future in their own countries. And believe me, making $50 a month carrying out jihad against the Americans is better than sitting in that village in Yemen just watching your life pass by. So they went to Pakistan, and they were young and inexperienced and stupid and confused, and when we started bombing Tora Bora, they all ran down the mountain and crossed the border into Pakistan, and we caught them. Well, that was going pretty well, because we would hit a house, 2 houses a night, and we're catching 1 at a time, 2, 5 at a time. One night, I think we caught 8. So I thought, well, this is actually going pretty well. And then we get word that Abu Zubaydah was somewhere in Pakistan. And my orders were, he's somewhere in Pakistan, you have to catch him and take him alive. The problem was though, that Pakistan is the size of Texas, and it has 230 million people in it. So to say he's somewhere in Pakistan, go catch him, it's an impossible prospect. We would get these cables from headquarters that were meant to be helpful. He's in Lahore. He's in Faisalabad. He went back to Lahore again. We think he went back to Faisalabad again. We know from his diaries that we captured, he was just driving back and forth between the two cities. And he was looking for a safe house. He couldn't find one that he liked. And so he was just looking around, driving around neighborhoods, back and forth. That's why we couldn't catch him. So I came up with a couple of terrible ideas that just were impossible and doomed to fail. And headquarters, again, was trying to be helpful. And they would send us these panicked emails in the middle of the night saying, we found what we think is his safe house. It's a mud building, and it's reinforced with 3-foot thick mud walls. And these are the geo-coordinates. And we would get a team together as quickly as we could, and we would drive over there at 2 a.m., and it was the maternity hospital the first night. And then the second night, it was the police station. So I had to say to headquarters, we appreciate you trying to help us, but please stop. We're wasting all this manpower. Let us figure this out. In the meantime, send us an analyst who can help us go through this information and help us find the guy. So they sent an analyst out, an analyst called a targeting analyst. Most analysts sit in their cubicles at CIA headquarters. They read all source information, everything from press to CIA reports to military and FBI reports, State Department cables, NSA intercepts, everything. And they think these big thoughts, they figure out what it means for policy, and then they send their reports to the President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, and the Chairman of the National Security Council, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A targeting analyst is somebody who's very tactical and very operational. So he'll come and go through a stack of documents or information this high and figure out how we can target different individuals. So this targeting analyst job was to narrow down Abu Zubaydah's possible locations as best he could to make it possible for us to find him. Well, the analyst worked on this for several weeks and then came to me and said, I can't get it down any lower than 14 possible sites. And I said, wow, we've never hit more than 2 places in a single night before. We can't hit 14. So I sent a cable to headquarters, and I said, we need a huge team, one big enough to hit 14 sites simultaneously. We need weapons and communications gear and night vision goggles and battering rams and ammunition and you name it. And they chartered a 737 and put these pallets of equipment on the 737 and sent us a team of 36 men, half CIA, half FBI. FBI because at the time, you'll recall, September 11th was still an open criminal investigation, as if we were going to actually prosecute somebody rather than just to stick him in a secret prison or in Guantanamo for the rest of his life without facing any charges. So the team arrived, and we did a lot of legwork and pre-operational surveillance. We looked at all these different sites to make sure that it wasn't a setup. We weren't going to go in and be ambushed. There was ingress and egress. And there were a couple of mistakes we made in this targeting of the 14 sites. One of the sites was a shish kebab stand that had a payphone. And there were obviously Al-Qaeda people living in the neighborhood. They would go to the shish kebab stand, make a phone call on the payphone, and then go back to their little hiding place. Well, you can't attack the shish kebab stand at 2 o'clock in the morning. There's nobody in it. Another one was a girls' school that we actually did raid and made a terrible mistake. I'll tell you that in a minute. So, in one night, March 28th, 2002, we hit all 14 sites simultaneously. And in the last site, the 14th site, we found Abu Zubaydah. When we began to break down the door, he, his bodyguard, and a Syrian bomb maker climbed to the roof of the house and attempted to jump to the roof of the next door neighbor's house to try to escape. There was a Pakistani policeman on the ground in between the two houses, and he shot each of them as they were jumping. The Syrian jumped first and was killed instantly. Abu Zubaydah jumped second and was shot in the thigh, the groin, and the stomach, again with an AK-47. And the bodyguard jumped third and was shot through the femur, nearly lost his leg in the end. So I asked the Pakistani, when I finally got onto the site, I was at the nearby safe house, our safe house. I asked the Pakistani, where's the guy? We never told the Pakistanis who we were going after. We said he was a big fish, but we were afraid that they would leak it to him, that we were onto him and we were looking for him, because we didn't trust them, frankly. So we called him the big fish, and then that became Mr. Fish. So I said, where is he? And he says, here's your man, Mr. Fish. And I looked at him. All we had was a 6-year-old passport photo of Abu Zubaydah, a handsome, young, thin, beard and mustache. This guy was a fat slob, clean-shaven, wild Albert Einstein hair going all over the place. I said, that's not him. At least I don't think it's him. He said, yes, this is him. This is your Mr. Fish. So I called the analyst. I said, what do I do? I said, they shot somebody, and they say it's him, but I don't know if it's him. He said, get me a picture of his eye. We'll do a retinal scan. So I kneeled down over him and I shouted, Iftah hayunak, open your eyes. But he was dying. He was bleeding to death, and he couldn't open his eyes. And when I opened his eyes, they were just rolled back in his head. All you could see were the whites. So I said, all I see are whites. I think he's bleeding to death. And he said, get me a picture of his ear. I didn't know until that night that no two people on earth have the same ears. They're like fingerprints. So I took a picture of his ear. This was the days before our phones had cameras. So I had to actually pull out a camera, take a picture of his ear, plug the camera into the phone, download the picture into the phone, and then send it to the analyst. He sent it to headquarters. And a minute later, they came back and they said, it's him. So we threw him into the back of a filthy Toyota pickup truck that the Pakistanis had commandeered, and we rushed him to the most horrible place on earth, Faisalabad Hospital. We arrived. By now, it's about 3:15 a.m. There were dogs and cats walking up and down the halls, swarms of mosquitoes just feeding on people's open wounds. They had this bar of Irish Spring soap with about a dozen syringes coming out of it. And if you needed a shot, they would pull the syringe out, fill it with whatever medicine you needed, give you the shot, and then stick it back in the bar of soap again. So here we are, a half a dozen Americans, dressed as Pakistanis in the middle of the night with an Arab who's bleeding to death. And I told the doctor, you've got to save this guy's life, in English. He was a little shocked, but they took him into the operating room and then tried to patch him up as best they could. In the meantime, word got around the Al-Qaeda community that we had gotten him. And so they began driving by the hospital and just opening fire on the hospital. I said to the Pakistani major I was with, if they realize that we're unarmed, we're dead. We have to get out of here. I said, can you find a helicopter? And he said he could. 20 minutes later, a helicopter landed in the parking lot, and I just walked into the operating room, and I said, Doc, wrap it up. We have to get him on a helicopter and get out of here. So the doctor sewed him closed as quickly as he could. We loaded him onto the helicopter and took him to a nearby Pakistani military base. He was in a coma for the first 24 hours. But during that 24-hour period, I received orders from headquarters that I was to not leave his side. The order was 24/7 CIA eyes on. Do not leave his bedside. But I was afraid I was going to fall asleep. So I tore up a sheet and I tied him to the bed. In the meantime, they took him back into surgery to finish this operation. He was bleeding so profusely. I mean, he was just soaked in blood. We were soaked in blood. There was blood pooling on the ground underneath the bed. And the Pakistanis were pumping as much fresh blood into him as they could, but it was just leaking right out again from his wounds. So the Pakistani doctor came out and told me, I've never seen wounds this severe where the patient lived. And I said, well, you got to try your best, because my orders were to take him alive. We didn't think your man was going to shoot him 3 times. But they saved him. He was in this coma again for a while. never really came out of it even before surgery. So it was another 12 hours or so. In the meantime, I was very dirty. This had been an operation that was ongoing, and we didn't have a chance to sleep or eat or get changed or anything. So I called a colleague of mine, and I said, could you do me a favor? At the safe house, could you get me a clean pair of underwear and a shirt? I said, I'm really dirty, and I got to get out of these clothes. So he brought me a pair of underwear, a pair of socks, and the only clean shirt I had was a T-shirt that my children had given me that I slept in. It was a red T-shirt with a decal of SpongeBob SquarePants in the middle. So about 6 hours after that, I noticed Abu Zubaydah is beginning to stir. So I got up and I stood at the foot of his bed like this, and I was looking at him. And I recount this in my book, that you could see the exact instant where he realized, oh my God, the Americans have me. Because he opened one eye and he looked at SpongeBob, and his pulse went from 110 to 220. And the heart monitor started going beep, 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 beep. And then the doctor ran in, and it's clear, and they shock him, and then they gave him Demerol, and then he was out again. So I sat back down for about 4 hours. I remember turning the ceiling fan on full blast so that the mosquitoes wouldn't converge on his gunshot wounds. I have a thing about mosquitoes. My wife laughs about me, but I consider myself to be a pretty tough guy, but I'm freaked out at the thought of something drinking my blood. It just is, from when I was a little kid, it's always bothered me. And just to see the millions of mosquitoes in the room, and they're all going after his wounds, it was disgusting. So I turned the ceiling fan on full blast to blow the mosquitoes away from his wounds, and frankly, to keep them off myself. So I waited there at the bedside, and he finally came around again. And remember, I had him strapped down on the bed like this. So he looked at me, and he went like this for me to come next to him. So I went up close to him, and I moved his oxygen mask. And I said, Shu ismek, what is your name? And he shook his head. So I said it again, Shu ismek. And he said to me in English, I will not speak to you in God's language. And I said, that's okay, Abu Zubaydah, we know who you are. And he started to cry, and he said, kill me, brother, please, take the pillow and kill me. And I said, no, we've been looking for you for a long time. Nobody's going to kill you. As a matter of fact, you're going to get the best medical care that the American government can provide. So he really started crying pretty hard. I think about this a lot. Even though it's been 14 years, I still think about it all the time. He said that he would never know the touch of a woman. He would never know the joy of fatherhood. He didn't want to attack the United States on September 11th. He wanted to attack Israel, but he was overruled. And after a while, he started reciting poetry that we later found in his diaries. He wanted to talk about the differences between Islam and Christianity. And then I felt like we had enough of a rapport that I said, I'm going to give you some advice. I said, I am the nicest guy that you're going to meet in this experience. My colleagues are not as nice as I am. If there's one thing you do, it should be to cooperate. And he said, you seem like a nice man, but you're the enemy, and I'll never cooperate. I said, well, suit yourself. He was very worried later on about what was going to happen to him. And I said, I'll tell you the truth. I have no idea what's going to happen to you. Nobody has said anything to me. I know that they're coming to get you. I know that there's a trauma surgeon on the plane. I know that you're going to be well taken care of. But beyond that, I can't imagine that the rest of your life is going to be easy. Well, the plane landed. I had been with him for 56 hours at that point. And he asked me to hold his hand while we wheeled him out onto the tarmac. I did. He was weeping quietly. And we maneuvered him onto the plane. We laid him across the luggage rack, strapped the gurney to the luggage rack, and I wished him the best, and he went on. 6 weeks later, I returned to CIA headquarters. I happened to be in the cafeteria one day, and a senior officer from the CIA's Counterterrorism Center approached me and said, "I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to ask you, do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques?" I said, "What's that mean, enhanced interrogation techniques?" I had never heard the term before. And very excitedly, he said, "We're going to start getting rough with these guys." And I said, "What's that mean, rough?" So he laid out to me the 10 techniques that eventually became the CIA's torture program. And I said, "That sounds like a torture program. How's that legal? We have laws against torture in this country." "Oh, no, it's been approved by the Justice Department. It's all legal." I said, "I don't think this is for me. You know what? Let me think about it for an hour," I said. Well, I had a friend on the 7th floor, the executive floor of the CIA. He had become one of the senior most officers in the agency. I had worked for him in the Middle East a decade earlier. So I went up and made a quick appointment to speak with him. And I said, "They just asked me if I wanted to be certified in these enhanced interrogation techniques. What do you think of this?" And he said, "First, let's call it what it is. They can use whatever euphemism they want, but it's torture. It's a torture program. Secondly, torture is a slippery slope. You know those guys you work with. You know what's going to happen. Somebody's going to kill a prisoner in custody. And then there's going to be a congressional investigation, and then there's going to be a Justice Department investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison?" And I said, "No, I don't want to go to prison." Well, it turned out I'm the only one who went to prison. But at the time I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. So I went back down to the Counterterrorism Center and I said, "This is a torture program and I don't want to have anything to do with it." So because I had said no, I was not read into this special compartment, right? Only special people got to read the cables that were coming in from this secret location where Abu Zubaydah was being held. In the meantime, I got promoted on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah operation, and I became the executive assistant to the deputy director of the CIA. Now, in that capacity, I was supposed to have had access to every cable that was coming in, every operation around the world. It's really a very prized position. But I was cut out of this torture program, and it turned out most everybody was cut out of the torture program. So what I was seeing in general classified traffic was, beginning on August the 1st, 2002, the CIA, its contractors, 2 psychologist contractors, began torturing Abu Zubaydah. They said, for example, by the time they got to waterboarding, and we'll get into that in a second, that they waterboarded him once, he had cracked, he had provided actionable intelligence that saved American lives and disrupted future terrorist attacks, right? That was a lie. That was the lie that was put into general traffic, knowing that eventually, if something was going to leak, it was going to be that. If something was going to be passed to the congressional oversight committees, it was going to be that. In the back channels, the eyes-only channels, and we now know this thanks to the release of the Senate torture report, they waterboarded Abu Zubaydah 83 times. He went into convulsions, he vomited repeatedly, he begged them to stop, and he provided no actionable intelligence that led to no disruptions of terrorist attacks and saved no American lives. Interestingly enough, the CIA leaders from the period responsible for the torture program recently came out with a book in which they said that the Senate torture report is just simply factually incorrect, despite the fact that the torture report is based on primary source, original CIA documentation. I would posit to you that they are the liars, because torture is their legacy. When they die and their obituaries are written, the obituaries aren't going to say, "This great patriot died. This great champion of freedom died." It's going to say, "This architect of our ill-advised and illegal torture program died." And so they believe that if they keep repeating this lie over and over and over again, that people either will be too stupid or too gullible or too lazy to do their own research and will believe that torture worked. I can tell you that it did not work. There's an FBI agent by the name of Ali Soufan. Ali and I worked together in Pakistan, and as soon as Abu Zubaydah was captured, Ali was sent out to the secret prison where Abu Zubaydah was being interrogated. Now, it pains me, believe me, it pains me in my gut to compliment the FBI. But they are really good at interrogations. Really good. You don't even realize you're being interrogated. And what Ali did was he sat across the table from Abu Zubaydah. Once Abu Zubaydah had recovered enough to be able to sit and have a meeting with somebody, he offered him a date or a fig or an apple or whatever it was, and they had a conversation. Over a period of weeks, Abu Zubaydah opened up to Ali and did provide actionable intelligence that led to the disruption of terrorist attacks, particularly in Europe. But the CIA didn't like the fact that the FBI suddenly had primacy in this case, especially because the locale was overseas. And the CIA is always supposed to be the primary agency overseas, while the FBI is the primary agency in the United States. So George Tenet didn't like this one bit, and he went to President Bush, and he said, I want the CIA to have primacy, I want you to order the FBI out. And the president said, okay, and he ordered the FBI out. Ali returned to Washington. Within 24 hours, the CIA began torturing Abu Zubaydah, and he stopped talking and never started talking again. The core issue here is one of ethics. There is no such thing as ethics training in the CIA. When you enter the CIA, you either have your own ethical standards, your own moral background, or you don't. Now, couple this with what I'm about to tell you. A CIA psychiatrist told me one time that the CIA actively seeks to hire people with sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths. Sociopaths have no conscience. They're unable to feel empathy, and they can very easily pass a polygraph exam because they're unable to feel guilt. Okay, they don't want sociopaths because sociopaths are hard to manage. They tend to go out on their own. But people with sociopathic tendencies feel comfortable working in moral, ethical, or legal gray areas. And I'll admit to you, when my bosses have come to me or had come to me in the past and said, hey, listen, what are you doing tomorrow? And I'd say, oh, nothing much. Okay, we want you to break into this house and plant a bug. I'd say, okay. And I'd break into the house and plant a bug or plant a camera or, steal some documents or whatever. That was the job. I had no problem breaking into places. I actually kind of enjoyed it. You get a little adrenaline rush, and then you think, USA, USA, right? We're the good guys, we thought. Well, let me ask you something about ethics. This is something that I often pose to university students, college students, because I think that this really encapsulates the idea of ethics in intelligence operations. Let's say that you are CIA case officers, and you're working in the Middle East on a counterterrorism issue, and you have recruited a major penetration of a foreign terrorist group, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever it is. And this guy is giving you real information that's allowing you to disrupt these attacks. So you're meeting with him in a hotel somewhere in the Middle East. And at the start of the meeting, he says to you, look, I've done everything you wanted. I've given you all this private, secret information. Now you're going to do something for me. I want you to go out and I want you to get me a prostitute right now. And if you don't, I'm not going to cooperate with you anymore. How many people here would get him the prostitute? Yeah, sure. He's a scumbag, but your job is to work with scumbags, right? So yeah, sure, you'd get him the prostitute. What if he asks for a child prostitute? Absolutely not. Absolutely, positively not. I would tell him, hey, you think you're the only game in town? You think you're the only person we have that's infiltrated this group? Now, he may be, but it's a child we're talking about. The sad point of this is that there's no guideline for this kind of thing. There are no rules. I can tell you firsthand that I've worked with people who would go out and get the child prostitute without giving it 5 seconds of thought, because it's not something that you have to cable back to headquarters and ask permission for. You just go out and do it, right? We're supposed to be professionals. We're supposed to be operations officers. We're supposed to be the tip of the spear, as they say, the cutting edge of American foreign policy. But you lose your humanity. And then there's nobody to tell you you're losing your humanity. This was a serious problem that I had at the CIA. It's a serious ongoing problem at the CIA. Now, besides the fact that the torture program was immoral and unethical, I maintained from the very beginning that it was illegal. We have something in our country called the Federal Torture Act. The Federal Torture Act has been on the books for many, many years, and it specifically defines and then specifically bans torture. To put it in a nutshell, it bans anything that makes a person physically uncomfortable, or it bans anything done on behalf of the American government by a private person that makes a person uncomfortable. So clearly, all of these 10 techniques were illegal. Now, there were two mid-level Justice Department officials at the time, John Yoo and Jay Bybee. And they somehow were able to turn the law on its head, a la, what does the word is mean? And they somehow concluded that because Al-Qaeda fighters were not state actors, they were not representatives of any one country, that they somehow were not allowed the protections of the Geneva Convention, in addition to the fact that the torture techniques were not torture. They were enhanced interrogation techniques, right? Different terminology. So that means it must be different. I've even given the CIA the benefit of the doubt. I've never called for the prosecution of CIA officers who believed they were acting within the law by carrying out these torture techniques. But again, we know from both the Senate Torture Report and the CIA Inspector General's report that CIA officers went far beyond what the Justice Department ever approved. For example, on the first day that Abu Zubaydah was tortured, he was subjected to a technique called walling. Walling is where the prisoner has a rolled up towel around his neck or one of those sleep pillows around his neck. And he's grabbed by the lapels or by the shirt and he's slammed against a wall. Now, the technique says in the rules, in the memo from the Justice Department, that the wall must be made of plywood so that there's a little bit of give and the prisoner doesn't get a skull injury. Well, on his very first day, the walling technique was used with Abu Zubaydah. Oh, but they forgot to put the towel around his neck. And the wall was made of concrete. Why wasn't that officer prosecuted? There was a prisoner by the name of Hassan Gul. Hassan Gul turned out to be innocent of anything, as many, many prisoners were, especially at Guantanamo. But Hassan Gul was subjected to a torture technique called the cold cell. So the prisoner is stripped naked. He's chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling so he can't move and he can't get comfortable. The cell is chilled to 50 degrees, and every hour somebody goes into the cell and throws a bucket of ice water on him. After about 4 hours of that, Hassan Gul died. But nobody was ever prosecuted for killing Hassan Gul. What about Maher Arar? Has anybody ever heard of Maher Arar? Maher Arar was a professor at a university in Canada. He had been in Europe. He was flying back to Toronto via JFK in New York. When the plane landed in JFK, 2 FBI agents went on board and took him off the plane. They wouldn't tell him why they took him off the plane. He was turned over to another government agency that has never been identified. And Maher Arar was flown to Syria, where he was tortured mercilessly for the next 18 months. Finally, after 18 months, the Syrians came back to us and said, "We think this is the wrong guy." And so we said, okay, let him go. He sued the American government. His suit was dismissed with prejudice on national security grounds, meaning if the CIA is forced to defend themselves, they'll have to reveal classified information, and they can't do that because we need to protect national security, right? So the suit was dismissed. I spoke with Maher Arar last year. He told me he has not been able to leave his house in 10 years. He has such severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He did sue the Canadian government, and they gave him a settlement of $6 million. But he said, they took my life. I mean, what do I do with $6 million? I can't leave my house. He'll never work again. And we've not even apologized. There's a second man by the name of Khalid al-Masri. Anybody ever heard of Khalid al-Masri? Sure. Khalid al-Masri was a German citizen of Egyptian origin. He was a greengrocer. He owned a fruit and vegetable stand. Now, the name al-Masri is Arabic for the Egyptian. So it's just Khalid, the Egyptian, right? There must be 10 million people named Khalid al-Masri in Egypt. Well, Khalid al-Masri had a fight with his wife, and he decided he needed a break. So he got on a bus and decided to visit his brother in Macedonia. In the meantime, a separate government agency intercepted some communications indicating that an Egyptian, a Masri, named Khalid, was going to blow up the American embassy in Tirana, Albania. And so some genius said, it's this guy, Khalid al-Masri. Because remember, nobody in the CIA speaks Arabic, right? So the CIA talks a host government into stopping this bus in the middle of nowhere. Khalid al-Masri is removed from the bus, and he is secretly flown to Egypt to be tortured for the next 10 months. Again, the Egyptians come to us and say, listen, we've done everything to this guy. We think this is the wrong guy. And it was the wrong guy. But when Khalid al-Masri was finally released and sent back to Germany, he had a beard down to here, he's carrying a Quran, and now he's a true believer. We created that fundamentalist. That was our fault. We did it on purpose. Well, this is typical of what happens inside the CIA's counterterrorism center. There was this feeling that we had so dropped the ball on 9/11 that we had the blood of 3,000 Americans on our hands, that we were going to do absolutely everything in our power to make sure that that never happened again, even if what we were doing was immoral, illegal, or unethical. And there was no oversight. That's what has happened to our country since September 11th. One of my attorneys, Jesselyn Radak, who's a famed whistleblower in her own right, has said over the years, all I want is my September 10th country back. You know, politics tends to be cyclical. It's a pendulum, and it swings back and forth. Well, on September 11th, it went like this, and it's been stuck there ever since. Laws that would have seemed insane to us 15 years ago are now the norm. NSA, which from the date of its creation was prohibited from ever collecting any information on American citizens, now has its primary mission to collect information on American citizens. We have a program where the president can order the deaths by drone strike of American citizens overseas who have never been accused of a crime, who have never confronted their accusers in court, and who have never had the opportunity to defend themselves. We just kill them if we don't like their politics. And then, in the most recent case, we kill their children and then say, oh, that one was an accident. My life changed, and not necessarily for the better, on December 17th, I think it was, 2007. Brian Ross of ABC News called me and said that he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I had never tortured Abu Zubaydah or anyone else. I've never laid a hand on him or anyone else. And in fact, I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I said, your source is either mistaken or he's a liar. Well, he said, an old reporter's trick, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself. I said, I'll think about it. Meanwhile, that same week, President Bush gave a press conference in which he said, we do not torture. My wife saw it at the same time I did. She was also a senior CIA officer. We looked at each other, and I said, he's a bald-faced liar. 4 days later, in response to a reporter's question, he said, if there is torture, it's the result of a rogue CIA officer. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to try to pin this on me. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll give you your interview. And I made a determination to myself that whatever Brian Ross asked me, I was going to tell the truth. To tell you the truth, when I resigned from the CIA in 2004, I really did walk away from these issues. I just didn't really pay any attention anymore. But I was vaguely aware that Human Rights Watch had issued a report in 2005 saying that the CIA was torturing prisoners. And in 2006, Amnesty International came out with a report saying the same thing. So in my mind, the information was out there. Well, Brian Ross asked me, are we torturing our prisoners? And I said three things that have just utterly changed the course of my life. I said the CIA was torturing its prisoners. Torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not a rogue. And that policy was approved by and signed by the president himself. So I did call the president a bald-faced liar right to his face. The next day, the FBI began investigating me. And they investigated me for an entire year. And then they determined in December 2008, after the presidential election, but before President Obama's inauguration, they determined that I had not committed a crime, and they closed the case. 3 months later, John Brennan, an old nemesis of mine from when we were both analysts together, asked the Justice Department to reopen the case. I had no idea I was under investigation again. They investigated me for another 3 years, and then in January 2012, I was arrested and charged with 3 counts of espionage, 1 count of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981. I'm only the second American ever to be charged with that. And a felony count of making a false statement. And my attorneys and I were never exactly clear on what exactly the false statement was supposed to be. It was thrown out anyway. But espionage, I mean, this is the gravest crime an American can be charged with. This is a potential death penalty crime. So the 3 counts were based on this. On one, I had given the New York Times top secret code word information that was declassified solely for the purpose of prosecuting me. And that information was that after the September 11th attacks, the CIA had a program to kill or capture members of Al-Qaeda. Top secret. The other 2 counts were just as ridiculous. This same New York Times reporter called me and said he was doing a story on a CIA officer who had been overt his entire career, never undercover, on LinkedIn, CIA analyst. Yeah, I mean, his email is like ciaguy@aol.com. Seriously. So he says, can you introduce me to this guy? I said, I haven't seen him in years, but I have a business card. He had resigned from the agency years before, and he went to work for a consulting firm. I said, he gave me his business card. So I scanned the business card, and I sent it to him, and I sent it to another reporter. I was charged with 2 counts of espionage for those 2 emails. Now, we challenged those counts of espionage in court, and my attorney said, Your Honor, this is the result of Mr. Kiriakou faxing a business card to a reporter. An unclassified business card for an overt employee. And the judge says, well, I find that very hard to believe. And she says to the prosecutor, Mr. I don't even remember his name. I think I just blocked it out on purpose. Some kind of psychological defense mechanism. Mr. whatever his name was. And he stands up and he says, well, Your Honor, Mr. Kiriakou should have known better that even if it was unclassified, he shouldn't have been talking to the press. And the judge said, but Mr. Kiriakou has a First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Well, yes, but... And she said, I'll entertain a motion to dismiss the espionage charges. And they were dismissed. But this whole process dragged on for a very long time. And my attorneys wanted to be paid. So I sold everything I had. I had a little piece of beach property, gone. All my stocks and bonds, gone. I sold all my personal possessions on eBay. And I gave my attorneys $150,000. Remember, my wife was fired the day I was arrested, just because she was married to me. She had a stellar CIA career. So we were both unemployed. And I said, well, how much do I owe you guys? they said, you owe us another $880,000. And this was like, September. So I said, if we go to trial, how much am I going to owe you? They said, another $1 million, perhaps $2 million, in addition to the $880,000. So my wife and I sat down with a calculator, and we tried to figure this out. It became an economic decision. But this is the Justice Department's goal. This is the plan. The plan is to bankrupt you. What they do is this thing called stacking, where instead of charging you with a crime, they'll charge you with 5 crimes, or 10, or 20, like they did to Tom Drake or Jeffrey Sterling, or like they're trying to do with Ed Snowden. And what they do is they bankrupt you, and they get you to the point where you're desperate, and you'll do anything to make this case go away. And so they come back and they say, we'll drop all the charges but one if you plead guilty. So do I roll the dice? Remember, I'm looking at 45 years. I'm 51. I'll die in prison. There's no federal parole, thanks to Ronald Reagan's Get Tough on Crime nonsense from the 80s. So do I roll the dice, knowing that the Justice Department wins 98.2% of its cases, according to ProPublica? We used to have a joke at the CIA. Saddam Hussein, I worked on Iraq most of my career. Saddam Hussein would win 98% of his in his presidential races, and we would laugh and we'd say the fix is in. And the Justice Department wins 98% of our cases, and we say, wow, they're geniuses. Never understood that. So do you roll the dice, knowing that you have a 1.8% chance of success, or do you just take the plea and make the thing go away? One of my attorneys, the one who I admired and respected the most, pulled me aside one day, and he said, if you were my brother, I would beg you to take this deal. This can be a blip in your life, or it can be the defining event of your life. Let it be the blip. And so they offered me 30 months. I'd be out in less than 2. I took the deal. In fact, it was a little bit embarrassing because on the day of my sentencing, I had to stand up, and the judge said, how do you plead? And I said, I changed my plea to guilty. And she said, do you admit that you committed this crime purposefully? And I said, no, I do not. It was an accident. And she said to my attorney, you need to consult with your client. And my attorney leans over and he says, you have to say you did it on purpose. And I said, but I didn't do it on purpose. And he said, I know, but you have to say that you did because that's the only way you get the deal. I said, sure, I did it on purpose. And she says, okay, I accept your plea, guilty, sentencing is in 3 months. But that's our Justice Department. I hadn't committed espionage, but in the Eastern District of Virginia, they would convict a bologna sandwich, especially when the jury is made up of people from the CIA, the FBI, DOD, and every defense contractor in Washington. What are your chances? I'll tell you one more thing about that, too. I laugh now, but it made me cry back then. My best friend's wife has an uncle who is the top jury consultant in America, O.J. Simpson jury, William Kennedy Smith, George Zimmerman, all the biggest trials. So he flew up to Washington, and he said, because you're Rich's nephew, I'm going to do this for free. So we had him get a security clearance, we read him into the case, and he came back and he said, if we were in any other district in America, we win this. But the Eastern District of Virginia, he said, you don't have a prayer. They don't call it the espionage court for nothing. And interestingly enough, I read later that no defendant in a national security case has ever won in the Eastern District of Virginia. I stayed up all night with my wife the night before I decided to take the plea. I was supposed to go to court at something like 10 o'clock in the morning, and at 7, I sent a letter to my attorneys saying, Heather and I had been up all night, and we decided we're going to go to trial. I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm going to fight. And the next thing I knew, they arrived at the house, and that's when we had the blip versus defining event conversation. And he said, you don't get it. You can't win. We're beyond the question of guilt or innocence. Guilt or innocence doesn't matter.